The town wasn't on any map I'd ever used. I only came across it by accident, chasing down a thread of local history that should have led me to a different place entirely. The county archive I'd been digging through mentioned a settlement established in the early 1800s, wiped away by fire sometime in the 1930s. Most such places never left more than a name behind, but this one did. It left a sound. I rented a house in the valley on a whim, telling myself I was doing field research. In truth, I'd been restless, tired of cities and their noise, and drawn to the kind of quiet where the land itself felt heavy. The place had one store, one diner, and a scattering of houses along roads that seemed laid down without intention. People nodded politely when I passed, but didn't invite conversation. There was a stiffness in their looks, the kind that said they'd seen strangers come through before and preferred not to hold them long. The house I took sat a short walk from the tree line, its roof bowed like the back of an old man, its windows cloudy with years of weather. The owner, a man in his 60s with hands cracked from work, gave me the keys without fuss. "Stay clear of the old ground near the ridge," was all he said when I asked about hiking trails. "Folks don't go there." I didn't think much of it until that first night. I'd just finished unpacking a few boxes, enough to make the kitchen usable, and I was sitting at the little table with a mug of tea. Midnight crept in unnoticed until it announced itself with sound. The bell rang. It wasn't faint, not a memory of sound carried by imagination. It was a full, resonant toll, deep enough that the glass on the table trembled. One clear strike, then silence, then another, measured, deliberate. I froze with the mug halfway to my mouth. I knew what a church bell sounded like. This wasn't recorded or mechanical. It was metal striking, vibrating, spreading out across the valley. The hairs on my arms rose. The bell kept tolling, each note so distinct I felt I could count the air shivering between them. The problem was simple. There was no church. I'd seen the town earlier, walked its short main street, and there was no steeple rising above the roofs. When the toll faded, I stood, went to the front door, and opened it to the night air. Stars were out, scattered between clouds, and the trees stood still at the ridge. The sound had come from that direction. The silence that followed was worse than the toll. I barely slept. Every creak of the house became a phantom echo. At dawn, I walked into town and tried to be casual when I asked the man at the store if there was a church nearby. He gave me a long look before shaking his head. "Not anymore," he said, and bagged my coffee without another word. Later that day, I pressed a waitress at the diner. She was younger, maybe my age, and seemed less inclined to keep her guard. "Used to be one," she said, sliding my plate across the counter. "Burned down, long before I was born." "Where?" I asked. She hesitated. "Up on the ridge. Folks don't go there now." I asked what happened, but she just shook her head, lips pressed thin. No one else in the diner spoke while I was there, though I caught the weight of their eyes. When I left, the air outside felt heavier, like I'd broken some unspoken rule by asking. That night I waited. I didn't mean to. I told myself I'd sleep early, ignore it, let it be. But when the clock crept close to 12, I found myself by the window, staring toward the ridge. The bell rang again. This time, I opened the door and stepped out onto the porch. The toll rolled through the trees, so clear I thought I could trace it like a path. My chest ached with each vibration. I counted them, 12 strikes, before silence swallowed the valley. I couldn't stay away. The following day, I hiked toward the ridge, following the road that curved out of town and then narrowing into a dirt track. The air cooled beneath the trees. Birds flitted in the canopy, but the deeper I went, the quieter it became, until even my footsteps felt intrusive. I found the church by accident, or what remained of it. The stone foundation sat like a scar on the land, blackened to the edges where fire had licked but not erased. No walls, no steeple, only outlines of what had once been, choked with weeds and moss. A hollow square where pews had stood, and a raised platform where an altar might have been. The air smelled faintly of iron, though the ground was bare. I walked slowly across the stones. A chill seeped through the soles of my boots. There was no bell, no shards of one, no sign it had ever been here. But when I stood in the center, I felt the faintest hum beneath my feet, like distant machinery. I crouched, pressed my hand against the stone, and nearly yanked it back. The ground wasn't cold, it was warm. The rest of the day blurred. I thought about what the waitress said, about the man's warning, about the way everyone seemed content to avoid mentioning it. They lived beside something impossible and had chosen silence over explanation. By evening, I knew I'd go back at midnight. I didn't tell myself it was research. Curiosity was thinner than that. The truth was simpler. The sound had taken hold of me. It was in my chest, in my head, echoing in silence. I needed to hear it again, needed to know. The ridge was darker than I expected. Clouds swallowed the stars, and the path back to the foundation felt endless. When I finally stepped into the ruins, I stood still, breath loud in my ears. Midnight came. The bell tolled. Not distant now, not across the valley. It was here, above me, though the air was empty. The strike rattled my bones, shook the ground, made the stone tremble beneath my feet. I staggered, hands out, half expecting to feel a rope swinging overhead. Another toll, louder. The air vibrated with it, and in that vibration I thought I heard something else. Not words, not voices exactly, but a texture of sound beneath the metal, like breath exhaled all at once. The 12th strike rang out, shattering in my chest, and then silence collapsed over the ruins. I stood frozen, throat tight, waiting for something, for a shadow, a figure, a confirmation. But nothing came. Only the warmth underfoot, pulsing faintly, as though the ground itself remembered the sound. I didn't go back to the house until dawn. My legs shook the whole walk down from the ridge, and every time a branch cracked in the woods, I thought it was the echo of the bell returning. The silence of the town when I reached it was worse than the noise had been. Curtains shifted in windows as I passed, and more than one person turned away when they realized I was looking. I sat at the kitchen table and tried to steady my hands with coffee, but the cup rattled against the saucer anyway. I kept replaying the sound in my head. Not just the strikes, but that undercurrent, the rush of something beneath the tone like breath or whisper, too layered to parse. By noon, I couldn't resist returning to the ruins. The walk felt shorter, as though my feet already knew the path. The sun overhead lit the ridge in pale gold, but the foundation still looked wrong. Charred stone didn't shine, it swallowed light. I traced the perimeter this time, walking slowly, noticing details I'd missed in the dark. Some of the stones were older than the rest, heavier, smoother, the kind that weren't cut by hand. A few were etched with marks, not letters, not anything recognizable, just grooves worn deep into the surface. The fire had blackened them, but the carvings endured. When I crouched to touch one, a small stone shifted beneath my palm, and the dirt beneath gave way. I brushed at it, revealing not just soil but something harder. Metal, a curved edge, no larger than my fist. My heart lurched. I dug until my nails tore and the earth stained my fingers. The object revealed itself reluctantly, a fragment of iron, too thick to be part of a tool, warped as though by heat. When I lifted it, it was heavier than it looked, dark and pitted, with a faint green patina. It was a piece of a bell. The air pressed down on me as I turned it in my hand. The shard was only a sliver, but it vibrated faintly as though remembering. I dropped it back into the dirt and stood quickly, wiping my hands on my jeans. The warmth in the ground felt stronger here, seeping up like a pulse. That night I lay awake listening. Midnight arrived without mercy. The bell tolled. The sound didn't just fill the valley, it filled me, running through marrow, blood, and teeth. My ears rang with its echo. On the 7th strike, the glass of water beside my bed quivered and spilled down the nightstand. On the 10th, my ribs ached. By the 12th, I swore the house itself groaned, beams creaking in protest. When it ended, silence pressed so sharply that I clutched the sheets just to anchor myself. Sleep never came. At dawn, I walked into town again, clutching my notebook. At the diner, the waitress frowned when she saw me. "You went up there, didn't you?" I hesitated, then nodded. Her lips pressed thin. She poured coffee but didn't speak until she slid it toward me. My grandmother used to say the fire was never just a fire. Said it started at the altar all at once, like the stones themselves caught flame. I leaned forward. What about the bell? The clatter of silverware stilled at the other tables. For a moment I thought no one would answer. Then the waitress shook her head. "Don't ask about that. Don't dig around. People leave it alone for a reason." Her eyes flicked at the older man 2 stools down. He stared into his plate, jaw tight, as though he'd heard something he didn't want to hear. I pressed anyway. "Where did it go? The bell?" This time the silence was worse than words. She walked away without answering. I stayed until I realized no one else would meet my eyes. When I stepped outside, the sky felt lower than before, gray clouds pressing on the town. The rest of the day I wandered the outskirts, circling back toward the ridge. I didn't climb it again, not yet. But I couldn't stop thinking about the fragment of iron I'd uncovered. If that was just a shard, where was the rest? When night fell, I couldn't sit still. The clock ticked closer to midnight, and I found myself walking toward the ridge again, lantern in hand. The path was quieter than before, the kind of quiet that feels staged, like something was waiting. The foundation was darker than the trees around it, shadows pooling unnaturally. I crouched where I'd found the shard and brushed at the dirt again, digging deeper this time. My fingers struck more metal, another piece, jagged and cold despite the warmth of the earth. I pulled it free. The first hole struck before I could drop it. The lantern swayed violently in my hand as the sound slammed through me, closer than ever. The metal shard vibrated in my grip, rattling so violently I nearly dropped it. A second toll followed, splitting the air. By the third, I swore I heard something beneath it, a low chant, not words I could understand, but syllables bent and reshaped by the bell's resonance. I clapped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The sound was in my bones, not my head. By the 6th strike, I staggered back and dropped the shard. It sank into the dirt as though pulled, vanishing from sight. The hum beneath the foundation surged, and the stones trembled underfoot. The 9th toll made the lantern's glass crack. By the 12th, the light had gone out, leaving me in darkness that felt absolute. The silence afterward was so sudden I gasped aloud. I didn't move until my breathing slowed, and when I did, I realized something chilling. The dirt where I'd been digging wasn't level anymore. It had sunk, leaving a shallow depression like the earth had swallowed the shard. The ground was still warm, warmer now, almost feverish. I barely remembered the walk back down the ridge. My hands stank of iron, my fingernails split and raw, and my lantern hung useless, cracked glass letting the cold seep in. When I reached the house, dawn was already threatening the horizon. I didn't even undress, just collapsed onto the bed and let exhaustion drag me into a shallow, uneasy sleep. When I woke, the clock on the wall was stuck at 3:15. My watch, which I'd set beside the bed, ticked normally. I shook the clock, wound it, reset the hands. They moved a moment before stalling again, the second hand jerking against some invisible wall. It stayed broken the rest of the day. I walked back into town that afternoon, carrying my notebook like a shield. The air smelled faintly of rain, heavy with electricity. I stopped in at the municipal building, if you could call it that, a squat brick office with faded curtains and a sign that looked half-rotted. The clerk was a balding man who looked at me as though I'd ruined his morning by stepping through the door. "I'm looking for records," I said, keeping my voice as casual as I could. "Anything about the old church or the fire?" He adjusted his glasses and gave me the same stiff look the others had. Records burned with the church. All of them? His silence was answer enough, but as I turned to leave, he added grudgingly, "County might have copies. Try the archive." The county archive was 2 towns over. I drove there, hands clenched tight on the wheel, listening for sounds beneath the engine. The roads wound through hills and woods, then opened on a weathered building where dust hung thick in the air. The archivist didn't ask questions. She led me to a back room and slid a stack of ledgers and bound volumes across the table. Most were dry, lists of property, population counts, tax assessments, but the church appeared often enough to trace its outline in the town's history. Founded in 1821, rebuilt twice, burned finally in 1939. The official report blamed faulty wiring. A vague note mentioned unseasonable storm conditions. No survivors were listed, but another document contradicted that, an interview with a woman named Clara Haynes, who claimed she had escaped through a side door before the roof collapsed. Her words were jagged in the transcript, as though the recorder had struggled to keep up. The rope was gone, the wood burned away, but it kept ringing. Nobody touched it, nobody could. I swear by God I heard it, over and over, while the fire took them. We ran, and it still rang. The interview ended abruptly. No follow-up, no obituary, nothing. I sat with the words too long, reading them until they blurred. The building's silence pressed in, punctuated only by the faint hum of fluorescent lights. When I left, the sun had dipped low, shadows pooling across the road. That night, the tolling didn't wait for midnight. I was sitting at the table, notes spread around me, when the first strike came at 11:37. My teeth rattled, the windows shook. I dropped my pen and pressed my palms to the wood, and the vibration carried up through the table into my arms. The second toll overlapped with something else, a vibration that wasn't sound, not exactly. My chest throbbed. I staggered to my feet, knocked over the chair, and braced myself against the wall. By the 5th strike, I couldn't tell whether it was outside or inside. My heart matched the rhythm, slamming against my ribs. On the 8th, the kitchen clock, the one that had frozen at 3:15, lurched to life, its hands spinning wildly, faster and faster until the glass face cracked. The 12th toll left the house groaning, boards creaking like they might split. Then it stopped. I stood panting in the silence. My skin felt tight, every hair raised. The air buzzed faintly as though reluctant to settle. I couldn't stay inside. I grabbed my coat and went back to the ridge. The ruins glowed faintly in moonlight, pale stones catching silver. The air was still, but the ground wasn't. The hum I'd felt before had grown stronger, undeniable now, a constant low vibration beneath my boots. I crouched again, touching the stone. It was warm, too warm. I pulled my hand back quickly and noticed something strange, a faint shimmer rising in the air above the foundation, like heat haze, though the night was cool. The shimmer pulsed in time with the memory of the tolls. I swallowed hard and forced myself to step onto the platform where the altar had once been. The stones here were darker, their surface cracked like dried clay. My weight made them groan faintly. I stood there anyway, staring at the empty air above, trying to imagine the bell that had once hung there. The silence stretched, my ears strained, waiting for the inevitable. When it came, it wasn't the toll, not yet. It was breath, not wind, not animal. Breath, a collective exhale, carried on the air, brushing past my skin like fingers. My knees locked, my eyes burned, and then the bell struck. The first toll nearly drove me to my knees. It wasn't distant, it was overhead, exactly where the steeple should have been, as if the bell still hung invisible in the air. The vibration crashed down into me, through me, into the stones below. Another toll, louder. A third. By the 6th, I could hear something else beneath it. Not breath this time, voices. Dozens of them, layered so tightly they became almost texture, a current beneath the sound. Prayers, screams, words I half recognized, twisted by the echo into a single river of noise. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it didn't matter. The sound came through the bones, not the air. By the 10th toll, my vision blurred. By the 12th, the ground itself seemed to pulse, heat radiating upward in waves. Then silence, but not empty silence. My own heartbeat pounded in my ears, too fast, too loud. I staggered back, slipped on moss, caught myself against the edge of the stone foundation. The stones burned against my palm. When I looked down, the grooves carved into them seemed to twist. Not letters, not symbols I knew, but deeper now, as though fresh, as though something had been pressed into the stone from below. The heat pulsed once more. I stumbled to my feet and fled, crashing through undergrowth until the town's faint lights appeared in the valley. When I finally stopped, gasping, I realized something chilling. The toll hadn't come at midnight. It hadn't waited. It was moving closer. I didn't remember unlocking the door when I stumbled back into the house. My throat was raw, my shirt damp with sweat, though the night outside had been cold. The walls leaned in around me, groaning faintly as though they too remembered the toll. I left the lamp burning until morning, too afraid of the dark pressing at the windows. The diner was half full when I walked in the next day, and every conversation cut off when the bell over the door chimed. I slid into a booth anyway, ordered coffee, and tried to ignore the eyes following me. The waitress approached slower than usual, the pot trembling faintly in her grip. "You keep going up there," she said. Not a question. I met her eyes. What was the bell, really? Not the church one. Before that? Her face tightened, the way someone's does when they've been cornered. She poured the coffee, set the pot down, and leaned close enough that I could smell the faint starch of her uniform. My great-grandfather said it wasn't made for the church. Said it was found, dug out of the ground when they first came here. They raised it into the steeple because they didn't know what else to do with it. Thought maybe if it was calling to something, putting it up high would keep the answer far away. Her voice shook, and she glanced over her shoulder before lowering it further. He told me the iron wasn't just iron. Said they melted down chains, shackles, even the gallows from back east to cast it. Metal that had already tasted too much death. Folks whispered it carried every soul it touched. I wanted to ask more, but her eyes darted toward the corner booth where an older man sat with his hat pulled low. He wasn't eating, just watching me. She straightened, snatched the pot, and walked away without another word. I left money on the table and stepped out, but the man followed me into the street. He caught up near the hardware store, his boots crunching against the gravel. "You're stirring things best left alone," he said. His voice was rough, broken by years. "You think you're the first to go digging? You're not. None of them lasted long." "I'm not trying to stir anything," I said, though the lie tasted bitter. "I'm trying to understand." He shook his head. His eyes were pale, watery, but the way he looked at me made me feel small. "You don't understand the bell. It doesn't ring to call us. It rings to answer." The words sank like a stone in my gut. That night, I didn't wait until midnight to go back. I went at dusk, carrying a lantern in my notebook, determined to see the carvings in clearer light. The ridge was hushed, the trees bent inward as though listening. The ruins loomed darker than before. The etched grooves across the stone seemed sharper in the fading light, forming shapes that looked almost human. Rows of figures bowed toward a larger shape carved above them, a perfect half circle, suspended as though in the air. The bell. It wasn't a drawing of a church bell hanging in a steeple. It was enormous, dominating the entire slab, drawn as though it were floating over the land itself. The bowed figures knelt in concentric rings beneath it, their arms outstretched in prayer or surrender. I traced the lines with my finger, and the stone burned against my skin. I jerked back, heart pounding, and in the stillness that followed I heard it again. Not the toll, not yet. Movement. Something shifted beneath the foundation, deep enough that it was more felt than heard. The ground trembled faintly, dislodging dust between the stones. My stomach turned cold. I backed toward the edge of the ruins, but the air itself seemed heavier, charged. My ears rang, though no bell had struck. And then, slowly, as if the world itself were winding up, The first toll came. It was wrong. Too early. The sun hadn't fully set. But the sound rolled out anyway, vibrating the trees, echoing against the valley. The second toll followed, and beneath it, something else. The ground groaned. Not like stones shifting, not like roots settling. It was low and long, a guttural sound so vast I couldn't imagine lungs big enough to make it. The stones beneath me vibrated, pulsed, as though something immense stirred under the earth. The third toll rattled my teeth. The fourth made my lantern glass shatter, plunging me into twilight. By the sixth, the groaning below had risen to a steady, rhythmic sound, almost like breathing. The voices came next. They weren't whispers this time. They were chants, layered and discordant, rising and falling with the bell's toll. I staggered back, pressing my hands over my ears, but it did nothing. The sound came up through my bones, through the soles of my feet, from the ground itself. By the 10th strike, my knees buckled. The 11th sent me sprawling onto the dirt, palms burning against the warm stone. The 12th shook the ridge so violently that loose rocks tumbled down the slope. The groaning cut off, the chants fell silent, and for one suspended moment the world held its breath. When the silence returned, it was so sharp it felt like the air had been sucked away. I lay gasping, chest heaving, too afraid to move. My eyes darted to the stones, to the carvings. In the fading light, I swore the figures etched into the surface had shifted. They weren't bowing anymore. Their heads were tilted back. Their arms were raised, reaching upward toward the bell. The breath I drew felt stolen. I scrambled away from the foundation, half crawling until the dirt swallowed my boots again. The ridge groaned once more, faintly, like something had settled deeper beneath it. The path down blurred, branches slapping my face, roots catching at my feet. When I burst from the tree line, the town's lamps twinkled faintly in the distance, but I didn't trust them. The air behind me still hummed faintly, too steady to be imagination. I didn't sleep when I got back to the house. I didn't even light the lamps. I sat in the dark, waiting, listening. The bell did not toll again that night, but the groan beneath the earth carried through the silence, steady as breath. The morning after the chanting and the groaning, I woke with the impression that the house itself had shifted in the night. Nothing obvious. The walls stood where they had been. The floorboards hadn't warped. But the air felt off kilter, like I was leaning forward on a slope I couldn't see. My ears rang faintly, an echo of the bell that hadn't rung since sunset. I couldn't shake the carvings from my mind. Those figures etched into stone, their arms raised in surrender, locked into that motion for decades until the heat made me see them differently. I wrote the details out in my notebook, trying to convince myself it was memory's fault, not the stones. The words wavered on the page. When I stepped outside, the town looked wrong in the daylight. The shadows were too long, as though the sun hadn't risen high enough. A dog barked somewhere and then went quiet with a yelp. The few people I passed didn't meet my eyes. One old woman paused as I approached, her grocery bag clutched so tight the handles tore, spilling apples across the dirt. She didn't pick them up. She just stared at me with something like pity, then shuffled off without a word. I drove back to the county archive. The road seemed to bend tighter than before, curling me inward instead of outward. By the time I reached the building, sweat had soaked my collar even though the sky was overcast. The archivist wasn't the same one as last time. This man was older, his skin gray with age, his fingers stained with ink. He watched me too long when I asked for any older records of the town, earlier than the church itself. Finally, he slid a drawer open and pulled a single ledger bound in cracked leather. The pages smelled of smoke and mold. They weren't written in the same hand as the others. These were jagged, frantic, words scrawled like confession. I flipped to the earliest dates. The entries weren't about building the town. They were about finding something. We dug into the ridge and struck it, iron unlike iron, humming in the soil. The men swore it was shaped like a bell. We lifted what we could, though much still lies buried. We built the house of God above it to sanctify what we uncovered. Another entry, months later. The sound came again tonight, not from the rope, not from our hand. It told itself, deep and long, and the earth shuddered with it. We offered cattle the next day, burned upon the stones, and the sound did not return for a fortnight. I flipped pages with shaking hands. More entries, scattered across years. It feeds, it must be answered. The bell keeps it asleep. The final legible page ended mid-sentence, the ink running where water had soaked through. My throat tightened as I closed the ledger. The archivist was still watching me, his face unreadable. I wanted to ask him questions, but the words jammed in my throat. Instead, I slid the book back across the desk and left. That night, I returned to the ruins, lantern fresh and glass uncracked. I told myself I'd only sketched the carvings, nothing more, but the dirt still called to me. The depression where I'd dug the shard had widened. When I crouched and brushed at it, my fingers sank deeper than before, soil loose and damp like freshly turned earth. The lantern's glow caught another piece of metal. Larger this time, curved into an arc, its edges rough where it had split. I pulled until my arms trembled, until the dirt collapsed inward and the shard rolled free. It was unmistakable now, the lip of a bell, blackened but whole, its surface mottled with verdigris. The size of it chilled me. If this was just a fragment, the bell it came from would have been massive, too massive to hang in any church steeple. I ran my hands over the surface. The metal thrummed faintly under my touch, not like an echo, like a heartbeat. Midnight struck before I could drop it. The toll crashed into me, rattling the lantern so hard its flame guttered. The shard in my hands vibrated violently, humming so loud I thought it would split my bones. I dropped it. The earth swallowed it instantly, pulling it down like water closing over a stone. Another toll. This one louder. The ground beneath the foundation cracked faintly, dust shaking loose. Another toll, then another. I counted, though I hated myself for it. 5, 6, 7. On the 8th I heard it again, voices, clearer this time. They weren't chants anymore. They were words, old words, twisted, drawn out, but I could almost hear the shape of prayer in them. Not human prayers. Pleas to something vast, something that answered only in vibration and fire. The 9th toll bent my knees. The 10th dropped me flat to the dirt. By the 11th, my lantern had gone out, leaving only the moonlight fractured by clouds. The 12th brought silence again, but this time it didn't stop cleanly. Something else followed. A groan rose from beneath the earth, long and low, vibrating through the stone. It wasn't just sound. It was movement, a shift. The ground swelled faintly beneath my chest, rising and falling once like a slow breath. I scrambled back, clawing at the dirt, and the carvings came into view again. I froze. They'd changed. The bowed figures on the slab now stood upright. Their arms were still raised, but not in surrender. In welcome. The great half-circle above them glowed faintly in the moonlight, its edges sharper, deeper, as though freshly carved. I stumbled away from it, heart slamming, bile rising in my throat. My feet hit the edge of the foundation and I nearly fell. I steadied myself against one of the older stones, but it burned so hot I yanked my hand back. The hum beneath the earth didn't fade this time. It continued, steady and rhythmic, a pulse that matched my heartbeat until I couldn't tell which was mine and which was its. I ran down the ridge, crashing through brush and branches, but even as the trees closed behind me, the vibration followed, faint but constant, a reminder that the ground was no longer still. I didn't trust the roads out of town, but I tried them anyway. The next morning I packed my bag, left the key on the table, and drove until the valley gave way to hills. The map on my passenger seat promised a highway, but the pavement bent wrong, looping me through the same stands of trees. I passed the same barn twice, its roof half collapsed, its paint scoured pale. By the third pass, I stopped the car and just sat there, fingers locked on the wheel. The silence outside was total. No birds, no insects, only the faintest hum under the tires, like the vibration had followed me even here. I turned around and drove back. The town looked hollow when I returned, its handful of streets lined with faces that turned away before I could catch them. Windows closed, doors latched. The sound of my car seemed too loud in the stillness, and I hated myself for how relieved I was to shut it off. That evening, I walked to the ridge again. Not because I wanted to, because not going was worse. The path was a tunnel of silence. Even the branches didn't sway, though the air pressed damp against my skin. The foundation waited, its stones darker than the soil, its carvings sharper than before. The depression in the earth where I had dropped the shard had widened further. The dirt looked freshly turned, damp as though from recent rain, though the sky had been clear for days. I crouched there, listening. The hum beneath the ground had become a vibration I could feel through my knees. My lantern caught movement in the corner of the ruins. I turned. Figures, not carved this time. Shapes pressed into the ash-dark soil, their outlines faint but unmistakable. Kneeling forms, shoulders bowed, heads tilted. They weren't solid, not flesh, but impressions. Burned shadows in the dirt like the remains of bodies caught in fire. I staggered back, but my boots struck something solid. Another slab of stone, half buried, taller than the rest. I wiped dirt from its surface and saw new carvings. Not a bell this time. A circle within a circle, lines radiating outward like sound waves. Beneath them, jagged shapes clawed upward. Not human, not animal, something in between. The settlers hadn't been recording worship. They'd been recording warning. Midnight approached. I felt it in the air, though my watch's second hand ticked steadily, uncaring. The first toll struck with such force that dust rained down from the tree line. My lungs seized. I dropped to my knees and pressed my palms to the dirt. The second toll followed. The third. The impressions in the soil darkened. What I had taken for flat shadows began to lift, rising faintly from the ground. Knees, arms, hollow outlines of faces burned into the night air, flickering like afterimages. The fourth toll made my lantern shatter, plunging everything into moonlight. By the sixth, the shadows had taken en masse. They leaned forward, hands braced on the stones, lifting their heads in unison. Their faces were wrong. Empty, smooth plains where features should have been. Only the tilt of their heads suggested recognition. The seventh toll shook the ground so violently I nearly toppled. The shapes shifted closer, though their legs didn't move. They slid across the dirt like smoke-gathering form. On the ninth, the hum beneath the earth surged into a steady vibration, pulsing in rhythm with the tolls. The shadows bowed again, not to me, but to something deeper, unseen. By the 12th, the ridge itself groaned. Cracks split between the stones, narrow fissures bleeding warmth. Steam coiled upward, stinking of iron and ash. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. The figures sank back into the soil, leaving only scorched outlines. The cracks remained, glowing faintly as though embers lay just beneath. The hum didn't fade this time. It persisted, steady and strong, a heartbeat beneath the ground. I stumbled back through the woods, branches whipping my arms until the first light of town came into view. The diner was closed, its windows dark, but a figure stood near the door. The old man from before, his hat pulled low. He didn't look at me until I stopped, panting, in front of him. "You saw them," he said, not a question. I nodded, unable to form words. He spat into the dirt and shook his head. "You've gone too far. Once you see them, you don't come back the same." "What are they?" I whispered. "Echoes. What's left of the first ones who heard it. They thought the bell was theirs to command, thought it would make them strong, but it was never theirs. It was never ours." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "The bell isn't what you think. It doesn't ring to warn us. It rings because something calls to it. and every time it answers, it remembers. His words crawled across my skin. I wanted to ask more, to force the truth out of him, but his eyes slid past me, toward the ridge, and he walked away without another word. The ground beneath my feet thrummed faintly, like a drumbeat carrying through the soil. I knew it wasn't done. I stopped keeping track of sleep. Nights and days folded into each other, every hour haunted by the memory of that groaning beneath the ridge, the shadows sliding upward from the dirt. Even when the bell wasn't tolling, its vibration hummed in my chest, a resonance that didn't leave. The house itself had begun to feel unstable. Glasses rattled on their shelves when no wind stirred. Floorboards creaked with no weight on them. Once, at dawn, the mirror in the bathroom fractured in its frame, though I hadn't touched it. A jagged crack split the glass like a spiderweb, the pieces trembling faintly as if struck by sound. I covered it with a towel and left it that way. The next night, the bell didn't wait until midnight. It came early again, and this time I didn't need to be at the ridge to feel it. The first toll split the silence inside the house, shaking dust from the rafters. The second made the lights flicker. By the third, I could hear things stirring outside, dogs barking, then whining, then silence. The seventh strike rattled every window pane. By the ninth, I swore the ground beneath the house was breathing, slow and steady, exhaling warmth through the cracks in the floor. When it ended, silence clamped down so hard I thought I'd gone deaf. Then a picture frame fell from the wall with a snap, the glass shattering across the floor. I couldn't stay inside. I pulled on my coat and walked into town, not caring that it was after midnight. The streets were empty but not lifeless. Curtains shifted as I passed. Doors locked audibly. Someone whispered my name. I stopped outside the diner. Its windows were dark, but a figure sat in the corner booth, unmoving, just a silhouette blurred by the glass. I didn't go closer. I kept walking until the street turned into dirt road, until the lamps ended and the woods began again. The ridge was waiting. This time, I didn't bring a lantern. I didn't need one. The cracks in the foundation glowed faintly, light seeping upward like coals buried in the soil. The carvings on the stones burned clearer than I'd ever seen them, their edges sharp, their lines deeper, like fresh cuts in flesh. And the shadows were already there. They knelt across the ruins, dozens of them, their outlines trembling as if caught between substance and smoke. Their heads bowed toward the center where the altar had been, their hands pressed to the dirt. They were praying. The bell tolled again, though the hour wasn't right. The shadows lifted their heads in unison. The second strike made them raise their arms, a field of limbs stretching skyward. By the fourth, the air filled with sound. Not the bell alone, but voices riding beneath it. They weren't whispers anymore. They weren't indistinct. They were words. I couldn't understand them, not fully, but the cadence was unmistakable. Prayer, worship, layered in dozens of tongues, voices piling on voices until they became a single wall of sound. The sixth toll nearly drove me to my knees. My ears bled. I tasted iron. On the ninth, I heard my name, clear, undeniable, folded into the chorus of prayers. I froze, breath ragged. The shadows didn't turn toward me. They kept their arms raised, their hollow faces lifted, but my name came again, carried inside the toll, as though the bell itself had chosen me. The 10th toll cracked the stone under my boots. Fissures spread outward, glowing brighter. The heat rising from them was unbearable, searing my shins, filling the night with the stench of scorched earth. On the 11th, something shifted deep below, so vast the ridge itself trembled. The 12th strike didn't bring silence. It brought movement. The fissures widened, bleeding light. Something pressed upward against the soil, swelling, shifting, as though the earth itself wanted to tear open. The shadows bent lower, prostrate, their hands clawing the dirt in feverish worship. I stumbled back, choking on heat, my vision swimming. The vibrations hammered through me, shaking my bones loose. The hum wasn't a hum anymore. It was a voice of its own, low and endless, a groan rising from a depth I couldn't comprehend. I fled before the cracks could widen further. My legs carried me down the slope, branches clawing at my arms, my lungs searing with every breath. The sound followed me all the way back to town, rumbling beneath the soil, beating against my ribs. When I reached the first row of houses, lights flicked on. Faces appeared in windows. Some crossed themselves. Others simply stared. No one opened their doors. I collapsed against the steps of the hardware store, chest heaving, sweat burning my eyes. The ground was still trembling. That was when I noticed the old town hall's doors were open, just a crack but wide enough for light to spill onto the street. I forced myself upright and staggered toward it. Inside, the air was thick with dust. The light came from a single bulb, buzzing faintly over a table stacked with papers. At the head of the table sat the same old man I'd seen before, hat on his knees, his face drawn tight. He didn't speak at first. He just watched me until I nearly collapsed in the doorway. Then he gestured at the chair opposite him. "You've heard it clearer than most," he said. His voice was rough, carrying centuries of wear. "You know what it's calling." I sank into the chair, unable to respond. He slid a leather-bound book across the table. Its cover was scorched, its pages brittle. I opened it with trembling hands. The drawings inside were crude but clear. Circles within circles. A bell, immense and wrong in its proportions, suspended over fields of kneeling figures. Beneath it, jagged shapes clawing from the soil. They built the church over it, he said, not to worship God, but to bury what they found. The bell was never theirs, it was never ours. It was the earth's, older than anything we know. It rings because something below calls to it, and it answers. I turned another page. A diagram showed rows of people on their knees before the bell, their outlines shaded dark. The caption beneath was scrawled, "The measure of the living against the dead." "What does it want?" I asked, my throat raw. His eyes lifted toward the ridge, visible faintly through the dusty window. "It doesn't want. It remembers. Every time it tolls, it calls the past back. Every time it answers, it gets louder, stronger. It's not asking, it's promising." The ground beneath the hall thrummed again, faint but steady. I shut the book and pushed back toward him, bile rising in my throat. The walls around us rattled. Dust sifted down from the rafters. The bell tolled again. Though the hour wasn't right, the window shook, the man's eyes closed. "It's listening now." "And it knows you." The toll faded, but the vibration stayed. It lived in the walls, in the table between us, in my teeth. The old man didn't flinch, didn't move. His eyes stayed closed as though waiting for the building to collapse around us. When it didn't, he opened them slowly. "You can't outrun it," he said. "You've stirred it awake. Now it hears you same as you hear it." I stood too quickly. The chair scraped across the warped floorboards, echoing louder than it should have. My hands shook, and the notebook in my pocket felt like an anchor dragging me down. I wanted to demand answers, but his face had gone blank, as though he'd said all he was ever willing to. Outside, the street was empty. The houses seemed to lean closer, their windows' dark eyes watching me. The ground was warm beneath my boots, a low pulse pressing up through the soles. I didn't go back to the house. I walked instead, drawn by the rhythm in the soil, following it through the outskirts, past the rusted fence lines and hollow barns, until the woods closed in again. The air grew thicker with every step. Even the night insects had fallen silent. The ridge loomed darker than the trees, the stones glowing faintly from their fissures. Steam curled upward in thin, wavering threads. My skin prickled with heat long before I reached the foundation. The carvings had deepened. They weren't static anymore. The bowed figures seemed alive, their arms trembling, their heads rising inch by inch. The bell above them pulsed, with faint light, its outline sharper, wronger. The hum grew louder the closer I stepped, until it drowned out my heartbeat. I thought I heard voices within it, not prayers this time, but words spoken low, urgent, threaded with desperation. I strained to catch them, but they slid away like oil in water. Then the ground shifted. The depression where I had dropped the shards had widened into a hollow, edges crumbling, soil dark and wet. Heat rose from it in waves. I peered down, and for the briefest moment, I thought I saw metal deep below. Curved, impossibly large, its surface glowing like coal. The bell wasn't gone. It had never been taken. It had only sunk. The air grew heavier, pressing against my chest. I staggered back, and my heels struck another slab I hadn't noticed before, half buried at the edge of the ruins. I crouched and brushed at the dirt. More carvings emerged, not kneeling figures this time, not worship, sacrifice. Bodies laid on the stone, knives raised above them. Blood etched in thick, jagged strokes, and above it all, the bell, radiating sound in concentric circles. I reeled away, bile burning my throat. My lantern nearly slipped from my hand. The settlers hadn't just built a church here. They'd fed it. They'd bound it. The hum swelled. The first toll struck before midnight, slamming into me so hard my knees buckled. The second rolled through the ridge, widening the fissures until dirt cascaded down their edges. By the fourth, the air was alive with voices, not distant this time, close, all around me. I turned in every direction, but the clearing was empty save for shadows that slid where they shouldn't. The sixth toll cracked a stone clean in half, the sound splitting the night like bone breaking. By the eighth, the chanting had returned, not faint but thunderous, rolling with the toll like a second bell. My name threaded through it again, clear, inhumanly stretched. The ninth tore the breath from my chest. The 10th split the earth wider. A roar rose from below, not human, not animal, but vast, older than language. The 11th made the shadows lift their heads, dozens of them, all at once, featureless faces turning toward me. On the 12th, the world seemed to split. The fissure yawned open. Heat blasted upward, nearly knocking me from my feet. Steam and ash poured out, stinking of iron and blood, and through the haze, deep below, I saw it. Not the bell itself, but the curve of something greater, impossibly large, stretching farther than the eye could follow. The shadows prostrated themselves, arms outstretched as the earth roared beneath them. I ran. I don't remember how my legs carried me, how I made it down the slope without breaking my neck. The air behind me pulsed with sound, each toll hammering closer, not just at midnight but whenever it wanted, whenever it called. The town was silent when I reached it. Not asleep, silenced. No lights burned, no doors opened. The streets lay empty, as though every person had retreated deep inside, waiting it out. I collapsed at the steps of the house I'd rented, my chest on fire, my ears bleeding. The vibration followed, rattling the windows, shaking dust loose from the rafters. It didn't stop when the bell did. For hours afterward, the ground kept humming beneath me, steady, unrelenting. The house wasn't mine anymore. The walls breathed. The floors pulsed faintly beneath my feet, carrying that same vibration I'd felt at the ridge. No matter where I stood, the hum followed, threading into my bones. I tried stuffing rags into the cracks of the windows, dragging furniture against the doors, but nothing silenced it. It wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from the ground itself. I barely noticed when the lights flickered and died. I sat in the dark, staring at the water glass on the table, watching it tremble without pause. Every so often, the faintest ripple swelled across its surface, not from wind, not from movement, from resonance. The bell tolled again before dawn, 12 strikes that made the rafters groan and the dishes clatter in their cupboards. My ears rang for minutes afterward, and when the sound finally faded, I realized the silence wasn't complete. A voice was still speaking, not chanting, not a chorus this time. A single voice, stretched and metallic, carried on the air like feedback through a broken speaker. I pressed my palms to my ears, but the words slid through anyway, too warped to understand, until I heard my name. It spoke it twice. The second time slower, deliberate, the vowels drawn into a drone that made my stomach cramp. I grabbed my coat and fled into the street. The air outside was worse. Houses leaned heavy, sagging into shadow, their windows blank. Doors were latched tight, but I could feel the weight of eyes behind them. The vibration didn't stop, and I left the house. It came with me, under my boots, humming faintly in the dirt road. I went to the town hall again. Its door was unlocked, swinging loose on the windless night. Inside, the single bulb still burned above the table, though the old man wasn't there. His book remained, its pages spread as if left mid-conversation. I turned them with shaking hands, more diagrams, more warnings. One page showed a list of names written in hurried scrawl, the ink bleeding as though the paper had wept. Dates were scribbled beside them, each name marked off one by one. My blood ran cold when I found my own name. It was written faintly at the bottom, the letters crooked, unfinished. No date beside it. Not yet. I slammed the book shut and staggered back, heart hammering so violently I thought my ribs would splinter. The bell tolled again, faint but clear, though no clock struck midnight. I left the hall and found myself walking toward the ridge, as though the sound itself dragged me by the chest. The path through the trees seemed shorter than before. When I broke into the clearing, the fissure had widened. The earth sagged inward, a massive wound in the foundation, steam spilling upward in hot waves. The shadows knelt and rose around it, not the faint outlines I'd seen before, but denser, darker, their shapes more defined. They swayed with the vibration, their arms raised as though holding up the sky, and the carvings had changed again. The slab at the altar no longer showed worshippers bowing beneath the bell. It showed them breaking apart, their bodies dissolving into concentric rings of sound. Their outlines were stretched upward, merging into the bell shape itself. I dropped to my knees, bile rising in my throat. The heat seared my skin, sweat pouring into my eyes. The bell tolled. Not 12 times, not counted. It rang without pause, again and again, overlapping, each strike louder than the last. The fissure glowed brighter. The shadows convulsed in ecstasy. The earth heaved, and then, within the noise, my name came again, clear this time, distinct, not warped or drawn out. The shadows all turned toward me at once. Their faces were still smooth, featureless planes, but their heads tilted in eerie unison. Their arms lowered slowly, then extended toward me, palms up as though offering. The fissure roared. Light and heat poured upward, curling the shadows in steam. Through the haze, deep below, I saw the curve of the bell, not a fragment, the whole of it. It dwarfed the ruins, its lips stretched wider than the church's foundation ever had, vanishing into the dark edges of the fissure. The surface was blackened, split with veins of glowing red. The sound of it didn't just strike my ears, it filled my chest, shaking my ribs, threatening to rip me apart. I staggered back, but the ground shifted beneath me. The fissure spread outward, cracking stones, swallowing soil. Steam blasted upward in jets that carried with them the stench of burned metal and something older, something fetid. The shadows closed in. Their hands brushed my arms, my shoulders, my chest, not solid, not warm, but cold as ash. They weren't dragging me. They were guiding me toward the edge. The vibration rose into a roar, my ears splitting, blood dripping down my neck. My knees buckled and I fell to the dirt just short of the fissure's lip. Heat blasted against my face, drying my throat, burning my skin, and through the haze I saw something impossible, a shape in the glow. Vast, skeletal, not human, not beast, something in between. Its ribs arched high like the rafters of a cathedral, its skull half buried, tilted back in a silent scream. The bell's lip rested just above it, as though the metal had grown from its bones. The shadows pressed closer, their arms raised once more in worship. The voice spoke again, not from above, not from the bell. From below, it was my name, drawn out, commanding. I scrambled back, clawing at the dirt, breaking free of the shadows long enough to stumble toward the tree line. The fissure roared behind me, but the sound seemed to follow, carrying my name on every pulse of heat. By the time I reached the town's edge, dawn was bleeding pale light across the hills. I collapsed in the street, gasping, my chest heaving against the vibrations still rattling in my bones. The bell had not been a warning, it had been a summons, and now it had spoken my name. The town didn't wake with me that morning. Doors stayed shut, curtains drawn tight, chimneys unlit. Even the dogs that usually barked at strangers were silent. The air was heavy, vibrating faintly, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. My body ached with exhaustion, but no rest would come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the fissure splitting wider, the vast curve of the bell glowing below, and that skeletal shape arching beneath it. I paced the floor of the house until the boards creaked in protest. My notebook sat open on the table, its pages filled with sketches of carvings, fragments of overheard stories, dates, names, evidence, if anyone had wanted it. But there was no one to show. The people of the town had lived with this too long. They had learned not to fight it, learned to wait. I couldn't wait. When dusk fell, I walked back toward the ridge, my body trembling with every step. The path seemed to draw me in, the trees arching overhead like ribs. The clearing glowed faintly even before I stepped into it. The fissure had widened further, a jagged wound spilling heat and light into the night. The foundation stones had shifted, tilted inward, as though gravity itself bent toward the hollow. The shadows were there again, not kneeling this time but standing, ringed around the fissure like sentinels. Their heads turned as I entered, dozens of featureless faces lifting in unison. The vibration grew sharper, pulling at my ribs, rattling my teeth. The first toll struck before the last light of day had died. It wasn't just sound, it was force, a wave that bent the trees at the edge of the clearing and drove me to my knees. The second came before I could rise. The third tore the breath from my chest. By the fifth, the fissure yawned wider, a canyon splitting the ridge. Heat blasted upward, carrying ash that burned my eyes and scalded my lungs. Steam poured into the night like smoke from a furnace. On the seventh toll, I saw the bell fully, its lip stretched impossibly wide, edges glowing with molten veins. It wasn't suspended, it was embedded in the shape beneath, fused with the skeletal ribcage that arched through the earth. Every strike wasn't just a sound, it was bone-breaking, earth convulsing. The thing below and the bell above were one. The shadows dropped to their knees in unison, their arms raised high. The voices returned, a chorus of worship so loud it drowned out the tolls, and threaded through them, unmistakable, was my name. On the ninth toll, the fissure belched fire. The ground shook so violently I sprawled flat, my palms burning against the hot stone. The 10th rattled the fillings in my teeth. The 11th nearly drove me into the hollow itself. The 12th never came. The fissure roared instead, the glow beneath surging, a scream rising from the earth itself. My ears bled, my body convulsed, and in the chaos I realized what the settlers had tried to do. The bell was never meant to warn, it was never meant to call, it was a lock. Every toll was a chain, a reminder, a weight pressed against whatever writhed below. But the lock had loosened. The fragments I had uncovered had weakened it further, and now it needed binding again. I crawled to the edge of the fissure, heat searing my skin raw. My eyes blurred with sweat and ash, but I saw the metal where it curved below, glowing red as though it had just been forged. The hum rattled my bones, threatening to tear me apart. I reached into my coat and pulled the shard I had kept, a splinter of the bell I hadn't dared return to the earth. It pulsed in my palm, hot, thrumming with the same resonance as the toll itself. My vision swam, my ears rang. I leaned forward over the fissure and let it drop. The shard didn't fall like stone, it sank. The moment it touched the glow, the sound sharpened, splitting the air. The fissure convulsed, soil collapsing inward, flames roaring higher. The shadows screamed. The bell tolled one last time, so loud the ridge split with a crack like thunder. Light swallowed everything. I covered my head, pressing my face into the dirt as the world convulsed around me. And then it stopped. The silence was absolute. When I lifted my head, the fissure was gone. The foundation stones had collapsed inward, leaving only rubble. No glow, no heat. The shadows had vanished, their outlines burned into the soil like faint stains of ash. The air was still, heavy with the smell of iron and smoke, but still. I stumbled down the ridge, half blind, ears ringing, my body trembling so violently I could barely keep my feet. By the time I reached the town, dawn was breaking. The streets were empty. Windows cracked open cautiously as I passed, but no one spoke. No curtains shifted. The silence wasn't the same as before. It wasn't waiting anymore. When I reached the house, I collapsed on the porch steps and sat there until the sun cleared the hills. The vibration was gone. The hum had left my bones. For the first time since I'd arrived, the valley was still. I should have felt relief. Instead, the silence felt heavier than the tolls had, because the bell was gone, the lock had broken, and though the ground had closed, though the shadows had burned away, though the toll had ceased, I knew it wasn't gone forever. It was only sealed again, waiting, and I had been the one to answer its call.